Well, first, thank you, Andy, for inviting us here to Bloomberg. This is really quite an
The
impressive
snacks are so impressive. If
Yeah.
I worked here, I would be
That's right.
giant.
Yeah, stick around. Hot food to come.
Really?
Oh yeah, soup. We do the whole 9 yards.
Very impressive place. Thank you,
Yeah,
David,
yeah.
for coming. And what we're here to talk about the Andrew R. Lack Professor of Journalism and the Business of Media Chair, the Professorship, and also, since I have both of you here, we'll take advantage of your expertise about the media and speculate a little bit about where the media is going and where journalism is going in particular. But first, I would like to start, Andy, with you just explaining a little bit about where this idea came from. What was it that you were hoping to address by creating this professorship?
Well, I've been hanging around journalism and the business of media for a long time. That intersection has interested me for the last 20 plus years. And the more you see how that intersection has got a fair number of traffic jams piling through, but at the same time, wonderful things are happening, you start to think, who's talking about this in ways for the next generation that is stimulating new thinking, new ideas, and analyzing what's going on? What are we doing? What hath we wrought? And so the comm school seemed like a great place to get that kind of conversation going, and going in an intensive way with people from 18, 19, 20 and on up.
How did David's name enter the picture?
Oh man, he's the man. He's the guy. He's got
It's like being the tallest leprechaun, the best
get
media
outta here.
report.
he's standing right in the middle of that intersection between journalism and the business of media. He's a journalist, but he's a very shrewd observer of how journalism is being distributed, being created, and in the context of the business of media, what are the models, what are the changing economics around that big word, journalism, for us?
What was it that you thought, this may be worth thinking about, having a greater conversation?
Well, two things sort of drive that decision. For one thing, we had a pretty thorough discussion about the evolving models of journalism, and I think we could both agree that anybody who's sort of in the business of predicting the future of journalism is going to get clobbered. If you had told me, Jeff Bezos is going to buy the Washington Post, the founder of eBay is going to put $250 million into a new news thing, a blogger from The Guardian will break the biggest story of the year, I would have started laughing. And so I'm a little out of the sort of future of journalism, but very interested in the present future that we're living in. So that's one thing. The other thing is I probably have been teaching, guest lecturing 20, 30 times a year, going anywhere that'll have me, partly because I have very strong opinions about sort of journalism education and its willingness or unwillingness to stay with this present future that we're talking about. And so it was an opportunity to kind of engage some of that rhetoric and see if I couldn't come up with a class, a bit of learning that would reflect those values and maybe redound to the benefit of the kids sitting in front of me. We'll see that first class, those poor kids, they're going to be my beta, and they could leave shaking their heads and going, what was that about? But I think we'll find a way.
Well, what would you hope to see? What would success be? How would you envision success in a class?
Well, I think that the old model of, work at your college paper, go to the weekly out in the boondocks nobody heard of, try and get to a strong regional paper, eventually get to a daily. That whole escalator is gone. And so how do they get from where they are to what is a very rich hiring environment in journalism? I think the main thing is they have to make things with their own two dirty little hands. And so we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about the making and distribution of media, and we'll do it by doing both of those things. And we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about back in the day. Back in the day, For one thing, it's gone for another. You know what? It wasn't really all that great.
That was right.
If you think about in real time, we can now know whether what the source is telling us is true or not. If they're ducking us, we can stalk them on Facebook. We can get them on LinkedIn. We can pop up on Twitter. We can guess at what their email is. The bag of tricks that the average journalist has is so much bigger than it used to be.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's that old saying about the good old days weren't. In some ways, I think that's true. You talk a lot about the present future. What do you mean by that?
I think, as Andy said to start with, there's so many models out there. We're at Bloomberg where a core terminal business is funding journalism that's seen as something that's of use to the users and giving them real-time information that's both efficacious and useful. That's one way to go. You have Huffington Post at the other end that's where it's not a narrow user base, it's the broadest user base possible. You have BuzzFeed, which is taking viral content and then overlaying it with a kind of a skin of serious news. You have a lot of mainstream journalists, Ezra Klein most recently at the Washington Post, Kara Swisher and Walt Mossberg leaving Dow Jones, who are now striking out either on their own or in alliances with non-legacy media companies. That to call that the present future, it's just there are all these bets all over the table and nobody knows what's going to work and what's not going to work.
Mm-hmm. Well, BuzzFeed, you mentioned BuzzFeed, I think it was just this week, they've gone out in search of 3 more investigative reporters. And so here's another direction, what tended to be the purview of major established legacy news organizations. Investigative reporting, very expensive, requires a sophisticated talent to do it, and now we're starting to see a startup like BuzzFeed, it's not a startup anymore, but jumping in it. What do you make of that?
Well,
can it be taken seriously?
Of course it can, because you have it used to be you had old line media, new media, and then old line media started adopting some of the discourse of what was going on in the web. And then much of digital media started thinking, you know what, we kind of have to get it right to do well. And then anytime they get a little money, and this is true of Huffington Post, this is true of Vox Media, this is true of BuzzFeed, what do? They go out and hire journalists. New York Times is busy with video, busy blogging, busy. So this thing that was these two things, we talk a lot about convergence, but this is one that's really happening to the point where 20 years from now, I'm not sure you'll be able to tell the difference.
Yeah, I think old media, new media, like Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, those party lines, those walls are coming down. It's storytelling. There are principles around storytelling. There are different use cases around storytelling. And there are different experiences with the way you consume news and information. And in a digital world, you consume it differently than we did. My parents consumed it differently than I did. These are the kinds of changes which, when you look in the grand scheme of things, to David's comment about back in the day is such a bore as a way of looking at, well, what does all this mean? This is part of the natural evolution of the great use cases of the technologies of our time, as opposed to what television and what video in your home represented for generations earlier instead of sitting around a radio. Do you want to cast this in what does this mean to reading newspapers, or what's happening on these platforms that are killing other forms of news consumption? I think that's a tough way to look at this, because summarizing news, for example, maybe you followed the kid, 18-year-old kid. He was 17, I think, when he sold to Marissa Mayer the Sumley. So what does he do? He came up with some software, correct me on this.
Yeah, no, it's correct.
That effectively takes long-form stories and summarizes them in a few sentences. Mm-hmm. Sounds like a pretty useful way to get some news and information that you might want. And then, lo and behold, this is the technology behind something called Yahoo Digest, which has the appalling premise of being offered twice a day, like your morning newspaper or your evening newspaper in previous generations. I mean, this all is of a piece to me. And I think to David's point, breaking it up into, well, what do these changes mean? They're part of what we should be expecting and enjoying and using and discovering in ways that make the passion that we feel for journalism and the opportunity as a business that it creates on all of these different platforms as we describe them, as maybe the golden age of journalism. Maybe we're walking into the best of all possible eras for what we do for a living.
I think, and you have to, I think we have to be aware when we talk about the future that we're living through. So the summary guy goes to Yahoo and he comes up with the digest. And so what it means is news is a list, right? Mm-hmm. On your phone, it's a list. Well, that brings a lot of fundamental questions in terms of what the hierarchy of that list is. Is it recency? Is it importance? Is it relevance to me? Is it relevance to my context where I'm sitting right now? That's a whole new set of questions that is fundamentally different. We every day at the New York Times at 4:00, our leadership gets together and decides what are the 7 most important stories in Western civilization, and they establish a hierarchy of images and headlines. That it's not like that doesn't have value. It has extreme value to me because everything's whooshing by me. I know what happened, but I don't know why or what was important. So somewhere between all that news zooming by on a digest or on Twitter and the full stop, New York Times, this is what we decided what was important yesterday, more or less a daily magazine. There's a whole lot of territory in between, and that's part of what your students, and now my students, which feels weird to say, are going to be negotiating.
It seemed to me one of the motives that you were driven by when you made this decision was a concern about where will the business model come that will pay for that kind of important journalism, the accountability journalism. Can you see good quality journalism with a business model to support it coming out of this soup that's now going on?
Well, one thing you see, which David pointed out at the very beginning, is you're seeing some very smart and actually very wealthy fellows coming into this line of work and engaged by it. Whether they made their fortune at eBay or in Amazon, they have a relationship with news and information and wanting to see it underwritten and developed and distributed in ways that protect its value and its credibility, would you say? And I'm dying to see what Bezos does with the Washington Post in a digital world, and all those who are circling these new opportunities with distributing and producing content in a digital world. There isn't a great business model for any of it out there, would you say? Not.
Well, I mean, to Andy's point, if the media space is so fraught and ultimately doomed that these threats are fundamentally existential, why is Warren Buffett in the business? Why is Pierre Omidyar in the business? Why is Jeff Bezos in the business?
John Henry.
Yeah, John Henry. And if you take even one step away from that, if you talk to an Eric Schmidt or you talk to a Tim Cook at Apple or Steve Jobs when he was still with us, their concern in the efficacy and richness of available information, not just data but news on the web, is something they bring up over and over again, because you can have the best search function in the world, but if it's crawling across a cesspool, it's not going to bring back much of anything interesting. In terms of what is working and what is not, a couple things I would point to, both the FT and Dow Jones, I guess we could say Bloomberg as well, were early about that the user of the news is going to pay a substantial amount of the freight, and that even when you switch platforms from a print product to a digital product, that the consumer of that information is still going to play a role. The New York Times gradually decided that that was the case, and we made this switch to a metered model, and a lot of people told us you'll disappear from the ecosystem of the web, you'll lose visibility, you lose uniques. None of that happened. What did in fact happen in 2012, which I think will be viewed as a watershed, consumer revenues, meaning money from readers, surpassed the money we get from advertising. I think that points a way forward that news has to be useful enough to be worth extracting money from the people who use it.
Mm-hmm. We have, I think recently, this week, Twitter story was that Twitter is starting to flatten out. Facebook seems to be flattening out a bit, and it's losing some of its younger readers. Is that because the space is getting more crowded and there's more choice, or is it just there is the hourglass has turned and something new will come up?
Personally, I think these ups and downs there's no interpretation you can apply to them. I think in the long run, whether it's called Twitter, I think Facebook is gonna be there for the long run, globally in particular. They're learning too. They're learning how much, these are interesting words that weren't in my thinking about business and journalism 5 years ago, 10 years ago. These words, aggregation, curation, algorithms, getting content in a form that didn't have any human decision-making around them. That said, you also see in that group of people David was mentioning, particularly the Bezoses and Zuckerberg now, and a different view of what they want from editors, for example, and how the content that you might be getting in lists with a BuzzFeed or a Sumly is getting more and more interest from them in structures that are familiar to us as journalists, using editors, hiring investigative reporters. Where that goes, I'm not sure, but I think it probably is all headed in a good direction.
Yeah.
I think part of what's going on is the life cycle of any business. Facebook is a pure utility, a social network for its users. What's not to like? At a certain point, they got to make dough. They got to make money. With Facebook, with Twitter, with Tumblr, with Instagram, that sort of inflection point over and over is when they go from being a pure play utility into being a business, how do they twist those knobs in such a way as to not offend their user base?
This generation of students that will be your students, and they have not known a world when there hasn't been, certainly the web, and the air they breathe, so to speak, has been digital. And there have been a number of concerns, probably from people my age, your ages, who wonder if perhaps something is lost in the process, that perhaps there's just too much information out there. This will be a generation that is unable to be reflective or think more deeply, have a longer attention span on things. Do you have any concerns about that?
Well, I think it's a fair worry, but I see guys like this kid I mentioned before, Nick Delosio, who came up with Sumly, and he's no indigent, lazy hipster who's not interacting or thinking through lots of interesting aspects of what he thinks about journalism and what you want, how you want to get your news and information, and what the business model is around that. So I think I worry a little bit. I got a 19-year-old and a 14-year-old, and sometimes you think that face-to-face interaction is slipping away while they nod into that 4-inch or 6-inch screen. But I can't say that I think that's, that doesn't haunt me at night. Right. I think it's just part of the excitement, really, around the changes that are now in our hands. This word mobile is just kicking everything we thought of in terms of behavior as it relates to content, entertainment, music, reading, and news consumption. It's just kicking it in the butt. And 3-4 years ago, I walked into this building, there weren't any tablets. I didn't have a 4-inch, 8-inch, 12-inch, 10-inch screen as a choice that I can't live without that screen. I can't go anywhere in the world without that screen. And it helps me read the New York Times, the FT, see my Bloomberg, Top Wire, Newswire. You gotta love this stuff. But what's it gonna do to human behavior? Our generations, our kids' generations? We'll see. I'm pretty optimistic.
This lament about a generation incapable of significant or long thoughts is a hardy perennial that comes up every 10 years. Now we're worried about the millennials. Before that, we were worried about the Gen Xers. Before that, it was the punk rockers or the hippies, I forget which, that somehow had lost their ability to think critically about what's going on. I've been both the problem and the old grampy pants, pointing a finger at each, and I think that we cycle through this. I find both in this, in the interactions with younger colleagues, with students, and indeed my own children, that they know a lot about a lot. How they know what they know, where they got it from,
Bit of a mystery sometimes.
Little bit of a mystery. And so if information is moving into them osmotically off the zipper in Times Square, off the chyron in the elevator, in their feed, what is to ensure efficacy? What is to ensure the quality of that information? But as a matter of course, I see the web and the ecosystem that we're living in as something of a self-cleaning oven, where things move from wobbly and sort of true into more and more true as it goes, and that through both the wisdom and the sourcing of the crowds, that information tends to move from not so great to great.
Mm-hmm. I saw a millennial data point too that struck me recently. One was that 50%, I think this was the Bureau of Labor Statistics or something like that, 50% of the workforce in 2020 are going to be millennials. Mm-hmm. So imagine their ownership of the workplace in many ways that will be dramatically different from the workplace that we knew 10 or 15 years ago.
I think you also have to be careful about that the pendulum swings. The importance of things and artifacts, actual physical objects, I think are going to have a little bit of a renaissance. And I think that if I see you on the train with your iPad, I know that you've got $500. If I see you on the train with a copy of Pitchfork, a very well-followed young website, a website for music that just put out a big, thick magazine of all things, then I know you and I have something in common. I do see a return a little bit. Dave Eggers, the author and American educator, and he runs McSweeney's, spends a lot of time on artisanal publishing, on coming up with artifacts. And I think between what he's up to, sort of the Arianna Huffington sort of slow down, look around, I think some of that's going to gain some traction. I think that's part of the problem that Twitter's having, part of the problem that Facebook is having, which is it isn't that people aren't engaging with those platforms, it's just they're not as engaging as frantically as they once were, because if I'm in here, what is going on up here?
Yeah, a little bit of junk food, maybe.
Yeah, and well, you want a balanced diet. I mean, I like my Cheetos as much as the next guy, but you want to be able to take in some Brussels sprouts every now and then.
You'd say, though, wouldn't you, that competing for their interest, their time, has never been more intense. The amount of things they can do, see, access, read, think about, watch. We didn't quite have that diversity of choice.
And I don't think I wouldn't put a demographic prism around it. I worked late last night, and so what was there at the end of the night for me? I had a section in the New York Times that I hadn't gotten to. I had a new issue of the New Yorker. I had the latest issue. of Wired. I had my Twitter feed, which I hadn't looked at all day long. That was all more or less waiting for me on the nightstand. The other thing that was there was my remote, my television remote, and I also have a Roku box. You know what, the latest episode of Justified, I had already heard that it was an amazing episode, and it's a show I love. It's sitting there on DVR, so that whole sack of stuff sat there, and I watched Justified, which, I gotta be honest, I was pretty happy with my choice when it got done, but it's this sort of paradox of choice that you talk about, there's so much opportunity in there, and there's also an opportunity for us to know what is good. And one of the things that I think defines this generation is you could say, well, they're constantly hunting and gathering. I don't know about that. In a story that Brian Stelter, my former colleague now at CNN, did a couple of years ago, a kid, I think he was a senior in college, said, you know, if information is important, it'll find me. And this idea that important stuff will surface and be made manifest in front of you, I think is one of the things that defines the generation.
The pleasure, actually, of having millennials in your house living there and watching them, observing them in our line of work, is to begin to trust what they're doing and how much they're absorbing and how smarter they may be getting from all that. And a lot of that process of watching how they're working is great, is helpful to inform our judgment about how we should be thinking about new technologies, new platforms, new ways to consume information. That engagement with that audience, that 18 to 24-year-old BU, and our ability to engage with them and have a really interactive conversation with them, opened up what we see, have them open up what they're seeing, using. I think that's a
great two-way.
That's I think what we can do. That's what school, at its best.
Well, a good way to wrap up is to circle on back, and it goes to there's been the discussion, the claim that journalism education today is an escalator to nowhere. Debate that. I don't. But
that seems sort of spicy. Seems sort of spicy.
And that, of course, is driven by the business models, the legacy media struggling.
I think some of the odious comparisons that are hanging around that notion of escalator to nowhere is that you can make a lot of money doing a lot of other things. And journalism has never been out there as a marker where here's a good way to get rich fast. Yeah. And somehow we're in a culture sometimes where that creeps in ways that I find a little dopey. But I actually think this will be the last reference to this fellow. I don't know him, but I'm enamored with what he did. Delosio. $30 million payday at 17 wasn't a bad way to make a buck trying to get into the news business. And there are a fair number of opportunities out there that I think, it's a good way to make a living. But we haven't figured out all the ways, I suppose.
The dirty secret that journalism has always been horrible to get in. You always have to eat so much crap to find a place to stand over and over. I have a daughter who's in our racket, this thing of ours. She's on her third job, and she had to do terrible things. She had to endure a lot of privation to get where she is. So did I. I waited tables 7 years, did writing on the side. It's always, if you're going to get a job that's a little bit of a caper, that isn't really a job, that is... you get to, under ideal circumstances, leave the building or at least leave your desktop, go out, find people more interesting than you, learn about something, come back and tell other people about it. That should be hard to get into. That should be hard to do. No wonder everybody's lined up trying to get into it. It beats working.